This is the fourth installment of our 2017 research webinar series, and we are pleased to have Dr. Susan Levine today as our presenter. Unfortunately, Dr. Montoya is not able to join us today for this webinar, which is entitled A 360-Degree Approach to Solving ME/CFS. Next slide, please. So the audience is muted. We will, I believe, have time for questions at the end of Dr. Levine's presentation, and I hope that you see a question box on the lower right on your screen, so please do type in questions there, and we will ask Dr. Levine to answer as many of them as is possible. These webinars are recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel, so if you, for whatever reason, have to miss and can't stay on for the entire webinar, you can catch it again later. And just, I have to say this as always, although Dr. Levine is a physician very experienced in treating ME/CFS, we and she cannot provide medical advice. So I hope you will understand that as you ask your questions. Next slide. So next slide. So just a quick intro for, let me do a quick intro for Dr. Levine. She is well known in the ME/CFS community. She is the founder of the medical office of Susan Levine in New York, and she has been treating ME/CFS patients since 1990. She is extraordinarily experienced. She's known both for that clinical practice, also her deep participation in ME/CFS research, and her volunteer commitments. Perhaps the most important of those is that she is the chair of the CFSAC and has, as I know personally sitting on CFSAC with her, has offered countless hours to further the understanding of ME/CFS. She additionally is a member of our SMCI Research Advisory Council, and further she's working with us on a research project with Dr. Maureen Hansen of Cornell University. So I know she has a great deal to cover today, and we're getting a late start, so let's get started. And please remember to type in your questions and we'll get to them as we can. So please, Dr. Levine.
Hi, Carol. Thanks for that nice introduction. I wanted to do a brief overview, but in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is just very briefly, as you'll see in the slides, review the origin of the new case definition for ME/CFS. I was trying to think of new developments in the last year since my last webinar. So we'll talk briefly about that. We'll talk briefly about some microbiome research I'm conducting or have conducted with Maureen Hansen, who you are now collaborating with. And then I actually borrowed some slides that I used for the Florida IACFS meeting where I gave a presentation. And then at the very end, we'll talk very briefly about a training program for ME/CFS, a fellowship training program that we hope to start at some point. Okay, next slide, please. Let me see. Okay, I don't know if you're, okay, there we go. Next. Next. Okay. This is just a little diagram to highlight all the different body systems that ME/CFS has an impact on. As all of you well know, it can cause the brain fog, cognitive impairment, post-exertional malaise, gastrointestinal symptoms, fatigue, unrefreshing sleep, the immune impairment, and, of course, orthostatic intolerance. Next. Okay, the next slide, even if you can't see it on the screen, is going to talk a little bit about the new clinical case definition for ME/CFS, which entails what the IOM report is all about. And it highlights the three major features of the new case definition. That is, clinicians can now diagnose chronic fatigue syndrome if there's 6 months of unrefreshing sleep, post-exertional malaise, and complete exhaustion. The difference between this new case definition and the older ones is that we don't have to exclude other disorders. In other words, people can have coexisting thyroid issues and other disorders as well. It's not a rule-out type of thing anymore. So that's the big difference. All right. So this is sort of the trajectory of the case definitions that's the history of CFS, ME/CFS slide. And even before 1934, there were outbreaks of what we now consider to be ME/CFS in various little pockets of the world, and these have all been archived in history books and so forth. And then the major outbreak, of course, in Incline Village and Lyndonville, New York, and then sort of that led to our current interest in ME/CFS. So every few years or so, there's a refinement of the case definition based on new findings. And, so this next slide kind of goes into that. What is myalgic encephalomyelitis? And the myalgic refers to the pain or tenderness in the muscles. Encephalomyelitis refers to the inflammation we feel is going on in the brain and spinal cord, most likely due to an active viral infection. And the next slide just sort of outlines the CDC case definition for chronic fatigue syndrome. So right now we're in the process of testing this new case definition that the IOM has come up with. And I'm finding it myself pretty useful because it's easy to apply and something that I think new clinicians won't be too fearful of and will apply in their day-to-day practice. The immune dysfunction in ME/CFS, now we're on slide 11, involves what we see or what patients talk about is sore throats, muscle pain, tender swollen glands, fever, new or worsened sensitivities of various kinds, food, chemical sensitivities, and an increased susceptibility to infections. Now I'm just going to jump into some work I've been doing with both Dr. Hansen at Cornell and also at Columbia with part of a multi-site study group with Dr. Levine and Hornig, and we're looking at the gut, not only bacteria, but other things like viruses and fungi that might be contributing to some of the inflammatory symptoms that comprise what we know as chronic fatigue syndrome. And in the gut, of course, there are many different organisms, and most normal people have a certain ratio of different types of bugs in their gut. It seems that in ME/CFS patients, this ratio is altered, and there's fewer species diversity in the gut. And not only that, but there's openings in the little cells in the intestine, the epithelial cells that line the gut, that allow leakage of these bugs into the blood and probably into the blood-brain barrier as well, into the brain and central nervous system. So the next few slides kind of demonstrate what we have found, what Maureen Hansen and her graduate student Ludo have found in the gut bacteria that they examined from my office and other offices. The people with ME/CFS had less diversity of their gut bacteria and also fewer important species of bacteria that are fewer of the good bacteria that produce substances that can improve brain function. So they have fewer bacteria of the good kind, and so that demonstrates the gut-brain connection. Because some of the substances that the good bacteria produce improve cognitive function. So if they have less of the good bacteria, perhaps that's the reason why cognitive function also is declined in these patients. Okay, and then it's what I started to say earlier, that now there's, in the ME/CFS patients, there's reduced intestinal barriers. So that's how the gut bacteria and other infectious particles can then move into the body and cause inflammation and all those symptoms I outlined earlier, the pain, the cognitive dysfunction, fatigue, flu-like symptoms, etc. So that's one very interesting connection that I think is going to take us to a lot of different places and potential treatments. I'm not suggesting in any way that treating the gut bacteria, because people ask me this all the time, with probiotics or even fecal transplants will necessarily restore, good health and make people much less fatigued. But I think it could be something that should be tried. It's an easy thing to try and to think about. Okay, I just wanted to review very briefly definition of a biomarker. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but what we are attempting to do here with ME/CFS is to develop something like either a blood test or a test that clinicians can perform in their office that will help diagnose this illness at a cellular level. In other words, instead of relying on the case definition, which is helpful clinically, that we have something that we can just come into the office. The doctor can either draw blood, send people for an X-ray study of some sort or nuclear medicine study, and we can really see a positive that distinguishes ME/CFS patients from the normal population. All right. Right now, and I apologize in advance, I'm going to jump into some slides that I presented in Fort Lauderdale, looking very specifically at allergic disorders and their higher prevalence in ME/CFS patients. So there's some slides in here that are a little small and difficult to make out, but I think what I really want to convey is that ME/CFS is one vast umbrella of subgroups. At least I've come to feel that way, and I think some of the researchers I've been working with have as well. So what we want to define, so first of all, atopic disorders, meaning allergy disorders, are more common in ME/CFS patients compared to normal people. And by atopic disorders, you'll see what I mean in the later slides.
Sue, I think you may need to request that we move ahead several or many slides.
Okay. Yeah, let's move ahead. Okay, that's fine. Let's move ahead to the results slide number 24. So, very briefly, we examined, ME/CFS patients with and without allergies. Okay, people with sinus problems, hives, eczema. Okay, and those ME/CFS patients that had those allergic disorders were much more likely to also have other debilitating disorders like fibromyalgia, problems hormonally, and other types of pain syndromes. So we found that very interesting. So now we're looking at the whole group of ME/CFS patients and distinguishing among those groups that those patients, and now I'm on slide 26, those patients with coexisting allergies of various types, but most specifically with sinusitis or hives, are much more likely to have coexisting gastrointestinal disorders, hormone disorders, and fibromyalgia. So I thought that was interesting, and I think each of those subgroups will deserve a further look and possibly come up with more targeted treatments for those patients as well. Okay. Interestingly, we did not find anything distinguishing autonomic dysfunction, and more commonly among the chronic fatigue people who had sinusitis and hives. Okay. I'm moving on, Carol, to slide 31, which I think is an interesting, and I know it's very tiny, but here you see the connection between nociceptors in the brain, that is pain receptors in the brain, and mast cells. Okay, mast cells produce histamine, and so there's a strong correlation between pain, I just thought that was an interesting visual, and histamine producing cells. Okay, so that's where I think it's an interesting area to look at. Now, I'm on the last lap here. The last thing I want to look at is training programs for ME/CFS. We want new doctors to come into this field, and so I gathered together this panel in Florida to look at different ways that we can do this. Okay, the majority of medical schools do not offer any teaching at all about ME/CFS, no introduction, nothing, and so we're trying to decide what's the best way to introduce this, and we think that to put it as part of a fellowship program, say for infectious diseases, to embed it in an existing program like infectious disease, neurology, endocrinology, with a special emphasis on ME/CFS is the best way to do that. And then that program will hopefully also have some other interesting features like how to do clinical research and how to, do other interesting things relating to specifically to ME/CFS and because of its complex nature, it fits into different homes. We've tried to find a home for ME/CFS basically, and then this could apply to mid-career physicians also wanting to make a change, let's say from jumping from one specialty to another. So anyway, okay, I'm wrapping it up.
Could you talk a little bit more about histamines in the body related to ME/CFS?
Yeah. Like I said, I think this is a very interesting topic. I have been hearing a lot about patients who complain about having hives or have itchy skin or who have just developed different types of sensitivities much more commonly than the normal population. So we're theorizing that there's a connection between mast cells, which are these allergic cells in the body that secrete histamine and tryptase and other substances, and what happens with ME/CFS. How that gets started is still not clear. Unfortunately, when you measure histamine levels in people's blood, they're not always elevated, so that's kind of difficult to make the correlation. But I suspect that the histamine is produced locally. Let's say it's produced in the brain or in other body fluids that we can't test for easily in an office setting.
Fair enough. Another question. Why would probiotics and fetal transplants not be helpful to ME/CFS patients?
Yeah. No, I didn't mean to imply that. I just, sometimes people think that this is kind of the answer. You know what I mean? Like restoring people's gut health through either the use of pro and prebiotics and or the fecal transplant.
Here's a question. Could you talk more about the mast cell connection with pain?
You guys are really getting into it. I thought it was like one of those little red herring things. No, I happen to enjoy learning about the mast cells. The mast cells are very interesting because interstitial cystitis, right, which I'm sure some of you have. If you do a biopsy of a bladder that's been affected by interstitial cystitis, there are mast cells in the bladder that are also causing the pain, that are relating to the pain in the bladder. So even though you don't think of the bladder as being itchy per se, or an allergy with interstitial cystitis, the fact that there are mast cells, allergic cells, residing in an area where there's pain is very interesting to me. Similarly, as I showed in that little slide, in the brain there are mast cells that are aligned with sensory nerves, which conduct pain, pain, sensation of pain. So I don't know precisely, but there's a whole pathway, if you look at the biochemistry of it, linking histamine and molecules that lead to anti-endorphin molecules, and chiarinin pathway, which is related to sleep and tryptophan production. So there's this whole complex biochemical pathways that cross with each other. So if you alter histamine, you might have some effect on pain and sleep. I don't know yet, what to do there, or which drugs or interventions to use, but it's interesting that there's that kind of connection.
Mm-hmm. All right. There are several questions about antibiotics, and can you comment on whether past use of antibiotics could contribute to this disease, and or if there are antibiotics which could be helpful?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's sort of like a double-edged sword. Many people say that they have been, for whatever reason, childhood acne or whatever, been on long-term antibiotics as part of their background before they get ME/CFS. And I do think that there obviously could be some problem with somehow destroying the microbiome or causing some alteration in the gut bacteria. Sure. So it's sort of a bad thing. On the other hand, minocycline and some other antibiotics may be useful in reducing inflammation in the body. In other words, some antibiotics actually help with pain.